As ISIS nears territorial defeat, the U.S. is calling on allies, including Canada, to repatriate and prosecute their citizens who traveled to Syria or Iraq to fight with the terrorist group. U.S. President Donald Trump said just 10 days ago that if countries fail to do so, the U.S.-backed Kurds may be forced to release these captured individuals. To date, the Canadian government has resisted those calls, but says that it's still working with allies to gather, quote, usable evidence to convict Canadian ISIS fighters. What's involved in that process and how difficult can it be? Bill Wiley is a war crimes investigator and executive director of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, an independent group that has been studying war crimes perpetrated by the Assad regime and ISIS. Hi, Mr. Wiley. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming in. I wanted to start off by asking you about this conversation that's been going on, obviously politically, but what we have heard from a number of experts and from the government itself is that gathering evidence against these individuals is, the bar is very high and it's nearly impossible. Is it nearly impossible?
Depends what you want to charge them with. So if you want to implicate individuals in war crimes, crimes against humanity, or indeed the crime of genocide, then it's quite difficult. There is some large troves of evidence that we can speak about that are just now we're starting to exploit in Syria and Iraq, but captured dash materials. But if you want to do a prosecution for material support or membership, if you will, in a terrorist organization, which is what most countries worldwide have been doing with returning Daesh fighters, or indeed a treason charge, although that would be unusual, this requires a great deal less evidence. Effectively, you simply need to demonstrate that the individual was a member of Islamic State.
And how do you go about doing that? I mean, what kind of avenues are there?
Well, the typical with the Europeans is most of these Western foreign fighters, foreign terrorist fighters as they're usually called, were social media savvy. So they were using Facebook and YouTube Messenger, these sorts of things. And they would post pictures of themselves in Syria, in Iraq, with a Kalashnikov in front of a Daesh or Islamic State flag with their finger in the air. It doesn't take a great deal of work beyond that to get a conviction. And of course, the prosecutors will be linked to security services. They can get into the mobile telephones if they get their hands on them of these guys and so on and so forth. So these are relatively easy cases to build.
I'll use an example to get your take. There is a fighter that left here, Abu Huzaifa was his name. He did a podcast for the New York Times, and he has come back to Canada. And in that podcast, he described, killing somebody. And all of this is, none of it is proven, but there was sort of a question among a number of people who were listening to that and watching that. Well, if he's admitting that, why can't there be something to be done about that? How do you gather evidence on that kind of a crime, for example, over there? Is that possible?
Well, with that particular individual, or a case like that, I can't speak to that particular guy, but you'd want to get into his social media accounts if he had any, and get your hands on his telephones or records linked to whatever number he had. There's a number of investigative avenues to follow, and to a certain degree, you can use his own admissions. Of a killing, that's a different issue. But he has, based on what you've told me, stated that he was a member of Islamic State. So you'd want some corroborating evidence typically, or a prosecutor would. But the question is if there's a willingness in a particular country to prosecute for material support.
And what is your impression of the willingness? I mean, you're over there, your group sometimes is collecting that kind of evidence. What's your impression overall?
It varies country to country. Canada is not the only country struggling with trying to come up with a policy with respect to returning Islamic State fighters, but the certain countries are very bullish. French, Germans, Dutch to a degree. Obviously the Americans, although they haven't had a lot of guys go to Islamic State. Canada, I don't know, has been slow off the mark. I can't say one way or another, but fundamentally, though, what's required is evidence, and even to build a fairly simple case, if you're dealing with dozens and dozens of suspects, it requires a lot of resource diversion from other forms of criminality.
Is that something that your group does?
Yeah, we were out ahead of the curve, if you will, looking at Islamic State in Syria when Islamic State was still quite small in early 2014. We followed them into Iraq in later that year, and we've had about 60 personnel working investigating Islamic State since 2015. So it's quite a big team. Majority of the personnel are deployed in Syria and Iraq, and then the analytical and legal components are based in our headquarters in Europe.
And what is that evidence used for? Is it used to prosecute them in various
it's
countries?
We're linked to domestic authorities, principally in Europe, where there's far more foreigners or Westerners went to Islamic State, especially from France, Belgium.
Having been on the ground, having seen the evidence that exists, do you think pursuing prosecution makes a difference? Do you think that it does it send a message? Does it matter? Is it consumed by?
It matters, as your viewers will know. It's an extremely hateful group, extremely violent group, and certainly my personal opinion is anyone who joined that group voluntarily needs to be held to account for that decision. The real challenge comes with trying to prosecute individuals for crimes beyond simple membership. This is quite difficult, and so as I alluded to earlier, we're working with the authorities in Iraq, especially in Baghdad, where there's a number of repositories of very large repositories of captured documentation. It was very bureaucratic, Islamic State at its height, and captured smartphones, captured computers, hard drives that we can suck the information out of. So we have an agreement with the federal authorities in Iraq, federal government in Iraq, and indeed the regional government in northern Iraq, the Kurdistan regional government. And so we're in the process of organizing that stuff now to make it available to Western law enforcement.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Wiley. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.